Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now if you want to pick up an old Dell T5600 workstation like this one, then there are a couple of things you should be aware of. First though, the positives. I paid just over £100 for this dual Xeon model after winning it in an eBay auction, and that really is the best way to get a bargain on one of these. Aside from the two 6-core 12-thread E5 2630s, this thing came equipped with 32 gigs of DDR3 and an 825 watt power supply. The inside is pretty much immaculate and the cable management is naturally excellent. The first thing I did was replace the thermal paste on both CPUs because it was all dried out and these chips were hitting 100 degrees in a matter of seconds when running the CPU intensive Cinebench test. With a combined 12 cores and 24 threads, these 95 watt Sandy Bridge EP CPUs did okay as far as the final R20 score was concerned, especially given that they are 10 and a bit years old. The high core count and generous amount of RAM means that this machine is still a solid everyday system and 1080p editing rig. But what are 24 threads without a graphics card to share their power with? Useless, that's what. The 825 watt gold rated supply comes with two 6-pin connectors by default, so hooking up most modern cards will be a problem right out of the box, but luckily that's where this handy little cable comes in. We can actually remove the included 8-pin to dual 6-pin cable and replace it with this dual 8-pin Amazon Find, which is made specifically for these workstations. This gives us more flexibility as far as graphics card options are concerned, and although it was overkill, I managed to hook up my RTX 3060 Ti to this thing without any problems. The side panel has some sort of weird handle on it that means we can't put it back, as long as this, or in fact most larger graphics cards, occupy the PCI Express slot, but it does have the potential to be used as a rather comfortable shield. So if you fancy a bit of medieval style combat and all you have is a T5600 workstation in your arsenal, fear not. As we look at some game results, I want to remind you that a more upper entry level or lower end mid-range card would be best suited as a pairing for these aging Xeons, but I wanted to get the most out of them today, and that meant using a card that would allow them to reach their maximum potential. Sometimes the older architecture lets them down though, and on other occasions not all the threads are utilised. There is still fun to be had regardless, and when you consider that E5 2630s can be picked up for as little as a £5 here in the UK individually, I think the following results are all the more impressive. Cyberpunk is a good place to start, and it seems as though the game can make use of all the cores and threads on offer here. What I said before about the 3060 Ti allowing the CPUs to reach their maximum potential is reflected by the GPU usage percentage figure on the left. The graphics card is only using around 50% of its power because the processors are the bottleneck. They're doing all they can. If you were to use a lower end card, say an older GTX 1060, you'd likely see the GPU usage percentage hit around 90 to 100. That's probably a more realistic pairing as well. Elden Ring will use the first 12 threads, but it doesn't like this older CPU architecture, and that's something I've experienced before with different processors. We've got the necessary power here, I believe, but something about the game or the game's engine means that we don't see much beyond 30 FPS. It's more playable with a frame rate cap in place, but it's not really all that enjoyable, especially in busier areas or when the action starts to heat up. I had a feeling that would be the case here, as we've seen similar things from equally as old processors. Mafia Definitive Edition will use a lot of the first CPU's first core, then every core and thread of the second CPU. I like the idea of running a dual Xeon PC as an editing rig in 2022. It's still a cheap and effective way to get into content creation, but a system like this is less effective in games, and you'd be better off just going for a stronger single chip configuration. Now that was probably obvious to a lot of you, but it's certainly not as fun or as interesting as using a dual Xeon setup, that's for sure. From what I've seen so far, up to and including Mafia here, it's the 0.1% lows that will suffer most. The average frame rate is fine a lot of the time, but these older CPUs will cause some serious performance drops on occasion. Even a single one of these chips overclocked in a compatible board would probably help alleviate that somewhat. Spider-Man, like Cyberpunk, can utilise all of our cores and threads, but that won't really help us out all that much as far as average performance goes. Plus 30 FPS is doable, but the age of the chips is once again the problem. 6 cores and 12 threads certainly sounds great on paper, and it can be deceiving because it automatically sounds good, if you know what I mean. Let's not forget that each of these cores and threads are still at least a decade old though, and will still struggle in some modern situations, no matter how much GPU power you throw at them. Counter-Strike Global Offensive is CPU intensive, but it won't actually utilise many of our cores, likely in part due to the age of the game and the way it was made. That said, it doesn't really need to because it still runs fairly well here with an average of close to 200. There are still a couple of little dips and drops like we've seen in other games, but these aren't completely off-putting and won't severely impact your ability to remain competitive. That said, it is easy to see why some wouldn't consider this performance solid enough. It's nice to see the thermal paste replacement has made a massive difference to those temps though, and both chips have remained reasonably cool throughout, whereas before they were hitting 100 degrees in the blink of an eye. In Apex Legends I turned things up to max but disabled spot shadows. We still averaged 120 FPS here and the performance was fairly consistent apart from a few dips at the start of the match. There's a 144 FPS cap which could be reached by using lower settings, but the game defaulted to max, so I thought why not go with it and see what happens. As it turns out the game isn't really making use of our second CPU anyway, but it does seem to be giving the 3060 Ti more to do, so this is definitely more GPU intensive it would seem. I think the old Xeon E5s are still somewhat capable even from a single CPU perspective. Considering the age, it's impressive what one of these can still do. I wouldn't necessarily recommend an old dual Xeon build, but socket 2011 boards are getting cheaper by the day, and considering that these CPUs don't cost much either, it may be a route that you might want to at least consider if you want something for light gaming and editing. Personally, I'd just put together a cheap 8th gen i5 or 1st gen Ryzen build instead, but that's the boring approach of course. Thank you very much for watching then. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know if you run a similar build or any Xeon build because I always find them fascinating, especially when used as gaming rigs. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.